Cleaner is arrested for theft, but the billionaire's daughter reveals everything, and what happens next shocks everyone. Clara ran the damp cloth over the coffee table in the main living room. The repetitive motion calmed her nerves. 2 years in the Ellsworth mansion, and she still felt like an intruder in this palace of glass and stone that others called home. The autumn sun streamed through the high windows, creating golden beams in the air. Clara tucked a strand of blonde hair behind her ear and checked the clock. 9:15. Lucy should be coming down for breakfast soon. As if summoned by her thoughts, small footsteps echoed on the polished wooden staircase. "Clara, you're still here." Lucy's childish voice filled the hall, breaking the meticulous silence of the house. Clara smiled as she saw the 6-year-old girl skipping down the last few steps. Lucy was the perfect image of her late mother, the same blonde hair in soft curls, the same blue eyes that seemed to capture all the light in the room. "Of course I am. I have to clean this whole huge house." Clara opened her arms to the little girl running toward her. Lucy hugged her with a surprising strength for someone so small. "You promised to teach me how to make bracelets today, and I will, after you have breakfast and I finish your father's study. Daddy left early. He said he has a very important meeting." "Again?" Clara noticed the disappointment in the girl's eyes. Charles Ellsworth had lived for his work since his wife's death. He was rarely present, even when physically at home. "Then we have the house all to ourselves," Clara winked conspiratorially. "But first, breakfast." As they walked to the kitchen, Clara felt the familiar weight of guilt. Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper, had already warned her, "Remember your place, Clara, you are not family." But how could she keep her distance when Lucy followed her like a shadow? When the girl showed up in her room at the back of the house, crying after a nightmare. In the kitchen, Clara made toast with jam for Lucy. The girl swung her legs on the high stool, watching Clara's every move. "Daddy said he's going to take me to the park on Sunday," Lucy commented, taking a bite of her toast. "Do you think he'll remember this time?" "Of course he will. Your father is a busy man, but he loves you very much. Can you come with us?" "That's a plan for the two of you, Lucy." "Father and daughter time? But you're almost like my mum now." Clara froze, the dishcloth in her hands. "Lucy, I work for your father. I'm the cleaner. So what? You tell me stories, you teach me things, you hug me when I'm sad. Sarah from my school said that's what mums do." Clara knelt before the little girl. "Your mother was very special and loved you more than anything. I just take care of you because I like you very much, understand?" Lucy nodded, without really understanding. The morning followed its routine. Clara cleaned the rooms while Lucy played nearby, making up stories about her dolls. At noon, they sat on the floor of the girl's room to make bracelets. "See how it forms a pattern," Clara demonstrated, weaving colored threads between her fingers. Lucy frowned in concentration, her tongue sticking out from the corner of her mouth. "It's hard." "You're doing great for your first time." Suddenly, they heard the front door open. Men's voices echoed down the hall. "Daddy's home!" Lucy ran out of the room. Clara stood up and straightened her uniform. She collected the colored threads and put them away in their small box. When she reached the hallway, she heard Charles's deep voice. "It can't have just disappeared, Brandon. It was Elizabeth's necklace." In the main living room, Charles was gesturing at his younger brother. Lucy watched from the doorway with wide eyes. Maybe you put it somewhere else," Brandon suggested, running a hand through his dark hair. Unlike his brother, who maintained a rigid posture, Brandon seemed uncomfortable in his own skin. "I know exactly where I put it. In the black velvet box, in the top drawer. It was there last night." Clara felt a chill. Mrs. Ellsworth's necklace was a valuable piece of diamonds and sapphires that, according to rumors among the staff, was worth a fortune. "Let's turn the house upside down," Brandon suggested. In the hours that followed, the mansion became chaotic. Drawers were opened, furniture was moved, closets were searched. Clara helped with the search while Lucy followed her father, trying to help in her own way. It was Jenkins, the butler, who suggested calling the police. Charles hesitated but agreed. When the police officers arrived, all the staff were gathered in the living room. Mrs. Winters, Jenkins, the gardener, the driver, and Clara. Lucy held her father's hand tightly. "When was the last time you saw the necklace?" asked the older police officer, a man with a time-worn face. "Last night. I always check. Does anyone have access to your room?" "Only the cleaning staff." Everyone looked at Clara. She felt her blood run cold. "I cleaned the room this morning," she said firmly. "I didn't see any necklace." "Did anyone notice anything suspicious?" the officer asked. "Unlocked doors, open windows?" No one answered. "It's obvious what happened," Brandon said suddenly. "The cleaner was alone in the room. She had access. There's plenty of motive." "Mr. Brandon," Clara protested, her face flushing. Charles silenced her with a gesture. Clara, you were the last person in my room besides me. The necklace was there when I left, now it's not." "Are you accusing me of theft?" Clara's voice trembled. "Do you have a better explanation?" Clara looked around. No one met her gaze. "I didn't take anything," she said, swallowing hard. "I would never." "Words won't bring the necklace back," Charles replied. He turned to the police. "I want to file a formal complaint. I believe she stole my late wife's necklace." "Miss, you'll have to come with us," said the older officer. Clara felt the world crumble beneath her feet. This couldn't be happening. It was a nightmare. "I didn't steal anything, I swear!" Clara shouted, the tears finally escaping. "Mr. Ellsworth, I would never do this, never." "That's precisely why," Charles answered coldly. "You earned our trust. You had free access to the house." "She didn't do anything." Lucy's high-pitched voice cut through the air like a knife. The girl let go of her father's hand and ran to stand beside Clara. Charles frowned. "Lucy, come here." "Now, no." Lucy grabbed Clara's hand. "She didn't steal it. She didn't steal anything." Clara felt her heart break. She knelt before the little girl. "Lucy, honey, it's okay. It's going to be okay." "I know who did it," Lucy shouted, turning to her father, her small face red with emotion. I saw someone go into your room." A heavy silence fell over the room. All eyes turned to the little girl. "Lucy," Charles said, his voice forcibly calm, "come here. We'll talk about this later." "No, you have to listen now. I saw—" "Lucy," Charles's voice thundered. "This is a grown-up matter. Go to your room." "Now, but Daddy, I said it's for grown-ups." Charles pointed to the stairs. "To your room." Lucy looked at Clara, then at her father, her blue eyes shining with tears. "Why won't you listen to me?" "Jenkins," Charles called, "take my daughter upstairs, please." The butler, visibly embarrassed, took Lucy's hand. The girl struggled, trying to pull away. "She didn't do anything, Clara, Clara!" Lucy's screams echoed through the hall as Jenkins led her up the stairs. Clara felt each one like a stab in the chest. "Mr. Ellsworth," she tried again, her voice choked. "Please, your daughter is trying to tell you something important. I didn't steal the necklace." Charles didn't look her in the eye. "Take her away," he said to the officers. The younger officer held Clara's arm firmly, not with brutality, but making it clear that resistance was futile. "This is a mistake," Clara said, as she was led to the door. "A terrible mistake." At the mansion's entrance, Clara looked back one last time. High up on the staircase, Lucy had escaped from Jenkins and was leaning over the banister, her face red from crying. "Clara, don't let them take you! Clara!" "It's going to be okay, Lucy," Clara shouted back, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "Don't worry about me. I'll tell the truth. I'll make them bring you back." Charles appeared behind his daughter, holding her firmly. Their gazes met briefly, his hard and unyielding, Clara's hurt and betrayed. In the police car, as it drove away from the Ellsworth mansion, Clara felt something break inside her. It wasn't just her freedom at stake, but the trust she had so carefully built, the bond with Lucy, the life that, despite being modest, meant so much. And at the center of it all, a question that wouldn't stop echoing. If it wasn't her, who had Lucy seen entering Charles's room? And why wouldn't he listen to his own daughter? 3 days had passed since Clara's arrest. The Ellsworth mansion, always so imposing, seemed to have grown even larger. The hallways stretched like endless tunnels. The ceilings rose higher. The walls moved further apart, as if the absence of a single person could somehow expand the physical space. Charles noticed it as he entered the dining room that morning. The long tables, always so neatly set, now seemed even more formal, almost intimidating. Mrs. Winters had laid out breakfast as usual. Toast, eggs, orange juice. Everything in its right place, everything flawless, everything wrong. Lucy was already sitting in her usual spot, her legs dangling in the air, not touching the floor, but her eyes, normally bright and curious, were fixed on her untouched plate. She didn't look up when her father entered. "Say good morning, Lucy," Charles said, forcing a light tone. Lucy didn't answer. She didn't even raise her eyes. Charles sat down and unfolded his napkin. The silence hung between them like lead. He poured himself some coffee and tried again. "Are you hungry?" "Mrs. Winters made eggs just the way you like them." An almost imperceptible shrug of her shoulders was the only response. It wasn't a yes nor a no. It was simply an acknowledgement that words had been spoken. Charles sighed and began to eat, or at least pretend to. Every bite felt like sand in his mouth. He could feel Mrs. Winters' gaze from the kitchen doorway, watchful, judgmental. "Your teacher called yesterday," Charles said, breaking the silence again. "She said you didn't participate in the group activities. That's not good, Lucy." Lucy finally looked up. Her eyes were blue, cold, accusing. "I want to see Clara." Charles put down his fork. "Lucy, we've already talked about this. Clara, she did something wrong." "No, she didn't." The girl's voice was quiet but firm. "Lucy, I know you liked her, but you don't know anything." Lucy slid off her chair. "I'm going to be late for school." "You've barely touched your breakfast," Charles protested. "I'm not hungry." Charles watched his daughter leave the room, her small steps slow, lacking the energy that usually made her run and jump through the rooms. Her body was present, but something essential had disappeared along with Clara. When the car took Lucy to school, Charles was left alone in the silent mansion. Mrs. Winters appeared to clear the table. "She barely eats," the woman commented. "Doesn't sleep well either. I hear her walking down the hall at night." Charles frowned. "Looking for what?" "I think she goes to the other one's room, to Clara's." A discomfort grew in Charles's chest. "I didn't know they were that close." Mrs. Winters gave him a look that mixed disbelief and pity. Clara was the first person Lucy looked for when she woke up, the last one before she went to sleep. Charles felt his face grow hot. How had he not noticed? Of course, he was always busy. Meetings, trips, phone calls. The company wouldn't run itself. After Elizabeth died, burying himself in work had been his way of surviving. But at what cost? For the rest of the day, while working in his home office, Charles couldn't concentrate. The image of Lucy, silent and distant, wouldn't leave his mind. He decided to finish early. Maybe he could pick her up from school, take her for ice cream. When Charles arrived at the school, the teacher greeted him with a worried expression. "Mr. Ellsworth, I'm glad you came. We were just about to call." Charles's heart raced. Did something happen? Lucy didn't participate in any activities today. She sat alone in the corner of the classroom. During recess, she didn't want to play with the other children. Charles looked past the teacher and saw his daughter sitting on a bench in the yard, alone, her small hands clutching her backpack. "She's been like this since—" The teacher hesitated. "Since our cleaner was arrested," Charles completed, his throat tight. Was Lucy very attached to her? Charles felt a knot in his stomach. Apparently, more than I realized. Seeing her father, Lucy didn't run to him as she usually did. She walked slowly, dragging her feet. In the car, the silence continued. Charles tried various approaches, questions about school, promises of ice cream, even mentioning a new children's movie at the cinema. Lucy answered with monosyllables or simply shook her head. At home, she went straight up to her room. For the first time in a long while, Charles felt lost in his own house. He walked through the rooms like a ghost, noticing things that had previously gone unseen. Lucy's small drawing pad on the coffee table, the colorful bracelets Clara had taught her to make hanging on his daughter's mirror. It was as if the house had become a museum of moments he had never witnessed, conversations he never heard, laughter he never shared. At dinner, the situation worsened. Lucy just pushed the food around on her plate without eating. "You need to eat, darling," Charles said, trying to sound firm but gentle. "I'm not hungry," Lucy repeated, the same words from breakfast. "Lucy, look at me." Charles waited until her blue eyes, so much like Elizabeth's, met his. "I know you're upset, but life goes on." "Not without Clara," the girl answered, her voice choked. Charles sighed. "She betrayed our trust, Lucy." "No, she didn't. She would never do that." Lucy dropped her fork with a metallic clatter. "Can I go to my room?" "You've barely touched your food." "Please." The word came out like a plea. Charles nodded, defeated. Lucy slid from her chair and left the room, her footsteps nearly inaudible on the carpet. The house suddenly felt immense and completely empty. Later that night, Charles was walking down the hall when he heard a soft sound coming from Lucy's room. He stopped at the door, hesitant. It wasn't sobbing or crying, it was a small, soft voice, humming. He recognized the melody. It was a lullaby Elizabeth used to sing. The door was ajar. Charles peeked in and saw Lucy sitting on her bed, hugging a teddy bear. The girl was rocking back and forth, singing quietly to the bear. "She'll come back," Lucy murmured to the toy. "I'll make her come back, I promise." Charles felt a pressure in his chest. His daughter looked so small and fragile in that oversized room. Without thinking, he pushed the door open and went in. Lucy stopped singing but didn't look at him. "It's late," Charles said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "You should be asleep." "I can't sleep." "Nightmares?" Lucy nodded. "Clara always came when I had nightmares." Charles swallowed hard. "I can stay until you fall asleep." "It's not the same." The simple, sincere words hit Charles like a punch. Of course, it wasn't the same. He was hardly ever there. He didn't know how to comfort his own daughter. "Lucy," he began, choosing his words carefully. "I know you liked Clara very much. I didn't realize how important she was to you." "You never notice anything," Lucy replied, her small voice carrying a truth Charles couldn't deny. It was true. At some point, between losing Elizabeth and drowning in work, he had stopped noticing, stopped seeing, stopped listening. And only now, in the oppressive silence Clara's absence had left behind, was he beginning to understand how much he had lost, the quiet affection that had grown before his eyes, day after day, without him ever noticing. The house, which had always seemed the right size, was now too big. And the emptiness that had settled in was, ironically, too small to be ignored. A week after Clara's arrest, doubts began to eat away at Charles like a slow acid. Not that he believed in the cleaner's innocence, the evidence was too clear. But Lucy's words, her absolute conviction, the way her blue eyes silently accused him at every meal, it all weighed on him. The house had become a minefield of silences. Lucy barely spoke. When she did, it was only to ask to visit Clara in jail, a request Charles repeatedly denied, with a firmness that diminished each time. That morning, while having coffee alone, Lucy had refused to come down. Charles made a decision. He needed to be sure, absolutely sure. Not for Clara, but for Lucy. To be able to look his daughter in the eye and say, "See? She really did steal it. There's no doubt." He started with the butler. Jenkins was a middle-aged man, always impeccable in his uniform, with a face that rarely betrayed emotion. "Jenkins," Charles called him into his study. "I need you to be completely honest with me." "I always am, sir," the butler replied, his hands clasped behind his back. "On the day the necklace disappeared, did you notice anything strange, anything out of the ordinary?" Jenkins thought for a moment. "I can't say that I did, sir. It was a day like any other, until you discovered the theft." "And what about Clara? Any suspicious behavior, nervousness?" "Miss Wright was always quite reserved, sir." "It's hard to notice changes in someone who is already so contained." Charles nodded, unsatisfied. "And my brother, Mr. Brandon, was here earlier that day, wasn't he?" An almost imperceptible hesitation. "Yes, sir. Mr. Brandon arrived around 8 in the morning. He said he needed to speak with you." I had already left. Precisely, sir. I informed him of that, and he said he would wait. He stayed in the living room for about half an hour, then left. Charles frowned. Half an hour just to wait. What did he do during that time? Jenkins averted his gaze. I can't say for certain, sir. I had my morning duties. Something in the way the butler avoided his gaze aroused Charles's suspicion. Jenkins, if you know something, you need to tell me. Sir, I wouldn't want to make baseless accusations. They're not accusations, they're observations, and they could be important. Jenkins adjusted his tie, clearly uncomfortable. I saw Mr. Brandon go upstairs, sir. I thought he was going to the restroom, but when I saw him again, he seemed agitated. Charles felt a chill in his stomach. Agitated how? Nervous, sir. Sweating quite a bit, and he left in a hurry without a proper goodbye. Why didn't you mention this to the police? Jenkins looked down at his own shoes. Mr. Brandon is family, sir. It didn't seem appropriate. To raise suspicion. Charles dismissed Jenkins with a wave, his mind racing. His brother, upstairs, agitated. Was this what Lucy was trying to say? But Brandon was his brother, family. Why would he steal Elizabeth's necklace? Mrs. Winters was next. The housekeeper, with her perpetually stern face and critical gaze, received Charles's questions with visible discomfort. Honestly, Mr. Ellsworth, I never fully trusted that girl, she said, smoothing her immaculate apron. I always thought she overstepped her boundaries, especially with little Lucy. What boundaries? A cleaner shouldn't get so close to the employer's daughter. There was something improper in the way the girl followed her everywhere. Charles felt a pang of irritation. Are you saying Clara was doing something wrong by being kind to my daughter? I'm saying, sir, that there are lines that must be respected, a proper place for everyone. Mrs. Winters pursed her thin lips. As for the theft, it didn't surprise me. People like that eventually show their true colors. People like that, you know what I mean, sir. Charles did know, and the thought made him uncomfortable. Mrs. Winters had always had a certain veiled prejudice against people she considered her inferiors. It was never explicit, but it was always there between the lines of her comments. Charles, thank you for your opinion, Mrs. Winters, he said dryly, dismissing her. The gardener was equally unhelpful. He had been working on the outside of the house that morning and had seen nothing. The upstairs maid said she saw Clara leaving the master bedroom in a hurry, but couldn't say if that was unusual. No one seemed willing to defend Clara openly, either because they believed she was guilty or for fear of contradicting their employer. That's when Charles decided to speak with Mrs. Palmer, the cook. She was a sturdy 70-year-old woman with white hair always tied in a tight bun. She had worked for the Ellsworths longer than any other employee since before Lucy was born. Mrs. Palmer, Charles called from the kitchen doorway. The woman turned, her hands covered in flour. She made no move to stop what she was doing. Yes, Mr. Ellsworth. I'd like to ask you a few questions about Clara. The cook's hands paused briefly, then resumed kneading the dough. What do you want to know? Your opinion of her. Did you know her well? Well enough. Mrs. Palmer's voice was neutral, but her eyes behind thick-rimmed glasses were sharp as blades. And what do you think? Was she capable of stealing? Mrs. Palmer abandoned the dough and faced Charles directly, something few employees dared to do. That girl is decent, more so than many people here. And she was the one who held your daughter when her mother was gone. Charles swallowed hard, but kept his expression impassive. What do you mean by that? The cook wiped her hands on her apron with firm movements. When Mrs. Elizabeth passed away, you buried yourself in work. Understandable. Grief is grief. But little Lucy, who comforted that child when she cried at night calling for her mother? It wasn't you, with all due respect. There were nannies, Mrs. Palmer, professionals hired to care for Lucy. Nannies who came and went like the seasons. None stayed more than a few months. The woman crossed her arms over her broad chest. Until Clara arrived. She wasn't a nanny, she was a cleaner. But she had a way with the girl, a gift. Lucy clung to her like a drowning person to a piece of wood. Charles felt his face grow hot. Still, that doesn't mean she couldn't have stolen it. No, It doesn't. Mrs. Palmer returned to her dough. But tell me something, Mr. Ellsworth. Clara worked here for 2 years. She had access to jewelry, cash, valuable objects. Why steal just now? And why Mrs. Elizabeth's necklace, of all things? The question hit Charles like a punch. It was true. Clara had had countless opportunities over the years. Why now? Perhaps an urgent need arose, he argued, more to himself than to the cook. Or perhaps... Mrs. Palmer replied without looking at him, sinking her hands into the dough with renewed force. Someone saw a perfect opportunity to blame someone who couldn't defend herself. Charles felt a wave of irritation. Are you implying someone framed Clara? Mrs. Palmer looked at him again, her small eyes piercing. I'm not implying anything, sir. I'm just suggesting you listen to your daughter. Children see things that adults ignore. They haven't yet learned to turn off their eyes and ears when it's convenient. Charles left the kitchen feeling as if he had lost a battle he didn't even know he was fighting. Mrs. Palmer's words followed him down the hall, heavy as lead. The conversations with the staff had left Charles with more questions than answers. Jenkins admitting that Brandon had been upstairs, agitated, Mrs. Winters with her hasty judgment, and Mrs. Palmer, the only one who had openly defended Clara, raising questions he hadn't considered. But what troubled him most was Lucy's certainty. The absolute conviction in her childish eyes when she said, Clara didn't steal it. I know who did. That night, after putting Lucy to bed, where she lay in silence, turning to the wall as soon as he finished reading the story, Charles locked himself in his study with a glass of whiskey. The doubts now spun in his mind like a frantic carousel. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Brandon. Charles, how are things? Is Lucy any better? Something in his brother's voice, a certain tension disguised as casualness, made Charles grip the phone tighter. Not really. She still insists Clara is innocent. A brief silence on the other end. Children, so loyal, aren't they? But she'll get over it. She'll understand that woman betrayed your trust. Maybe, Charles replied vaguely. Brandon, on the day of the theft, you were here in the morning, right? The hesitation was almost imperceptible. Yeah, I stopped by quickly. I needed to talk about that investment, remember? But you had already left, and you waited for half an hour. Something like that. Why? Jenkins said you went upstairs. Another silence. This one longer. Oh, right. I went to the restroom. You know how my bladder has been since that infection last year. Charles closed his eyes. Brandon had never had bladder problems. There had never been any infection. Of course, he said, keeping his voice neutral. I'm just trying to understand what happened that day. Well, it's obvious what happened. The cleaner saw an opportunity and took it. She probably already had a buyer for the necklace. Those people always have contacts in the underworld. Those people, Charles repeated slowly, as Mrs. Winters would say. What? Nothing. I have to go. Good night, Brandon. After hanging up, Charles remained motionless, staring at the phone. Something was wrong. Very wrong. A growing sense that he had made a terrible error in judgment. He picked up the phone again and dialed a number he had saved years ago but never used. After 3 rings, a deep voice answered. Rawlins. Mr. Rawlins, this is Charles Ellsworth. I believe we have a mutual friend, George Harrington. Ah, yes. George mentioned you might call someday. How can I help you? I need absolute discretion. This is a delicate matter. Discretion is my middle name, Mr. Ellsworth. Why don't we meet tomorrow? Say 10 o'clock at the Harbour View Cafe. I'll be there. Charles hung up, feeling a momentary sense of relief. Michael Rawlins was a former police officer who now worked as a private investigator. He had a reputation for being meticulous, discreet, and above all, effective. If there was anyone who could get to the truth, whatever it was him. The next morning, after dropping Lucy at school, another silent journey broken only by the low radio, Charles drove to the Harbour View, a discreet cafe by the docks. Rawlins was already there, sitting at a table in the back, his back to the wall. He was a middle-aged man with closely cropped grey hair and sharp eyes that seemed to register every detail. He wore a simple but well-cut suit and bore no resemblance to the stereotype of the disheveled detective. "Mr. Ellsworth," he greeted, extending a hand. "Punctual. I like that." Charles sat down, politely declining the offer of coffee. "Let's get straight to the point, Mr. Rawlins. A week ago, a valuable necklace disappeared from my home. An employee was arrested, accused of the theft." "And you believe she's innocent?" Rawlins asked, his eyes fixed on Charles. I don't know." The admission cost Charles more than he expected. "There was circumstantial evidence. She was alone in the room, she had access, but my daughter insists she saw someone else enter my room that day." "Who?" Charles hesitated. "My brother, Brandon." Rawlins showed no surprise. He just nodded as if confirming something he already suspected. "Children are often reliable witnesses, you know. They notice details adults ignore, and they have no reason to lie, unless they're protecting someone." "Lucy adored Clara," Charles admitted. "They were close. That might explain why your daughter wants to defend the employee, but it doesn't explain why she would accuse her uncle." Rawlins took a sip of his coffee. "Unless she really did see him." Charles rubbed his face, feeling the weight of a week of sleepless nights. "I want the truth, Mr. Rawlins. Whatever it is. And are you prepared to accept that truth, even if it's not the one you were hoping for?" The question hung between them like a heavy cloud. "Yes," Charles answered after a moment. "I need to know." Rawlins nodded, satisfied. "I'll need access to your house, to speak with the staff, to check records, cameras if you have them. Do whatever is necessary. Money is not an issue. It never is, for people like you," Rawlins commented without resentment, just stating a fact. "But the truth sometimes costs more than money can buy." Charles looked at him. "What do you mean?" "That some truths require us to abandon comfortable certainties. They require humility, the ability to admit mistakes." Rawlins closed his notebook. "Are you prepared for that, Mr. Ellsworth?" Charles didn't answer right away. He was used to being the man with all the answers. The man who made tough decisions without flinching. The man who didn't make mistakes. But then he thought of Lucy, sitting alone at the breakfast table, her blue eyes empty of joy. He thought of Mrs. Palmer's voice. "She was the one who held your daughter when her mother was gone." He thought of Clara, a 30-year-old woman, in jail for a crime she just might not have committed. "I'm prepared," he said finally. Rawlins smiled, a smile that didn't reach his perceptive eyes. "Then let's begin, and Mr. Ellsworth." "Yes? Don't tell anyone about my investigation, especially your brother." Charles nodded, feeling a chill. The truth, he realized, was already on its way. The question was, would he really be ready to hear it? Leaving the cafe, Charles felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Until now, he had chosen the easy path, accusing the most vulnerable person, the one who could least defend herself. It was what Mrs. Winters expected, what Brandon wanted, what society would consider natural. But what if he was wrong? What would he say to Lucy? How would he look at Clara again? And more importantly, how would he live with himself knowing he had destroyed an innocent person's life? As he drove back to the silent, empty mansion, he thought of Lucy, how he preferred to cling to cold facts, to evidence, to logic, anything to avoid facing his daughter's feelings. It was easier to hire a detective to investigate the theft than to look a 6-year-old in the eye and admit, maybe I was wrong. The truth, Charles was beginning to realize, was like a distant echo. You can ignore it for a while, pretend you don't hear it, but eventually it comes back, stronger, clearer, impossible to deny. Some voices are only heard too late. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late for him. 2 weeks had passed since hiring the detective, Rawlins. He worked quietly, interviewing staff when Charles wasn't around, gathering records, checking security cameras in the neighborhood. His presence in the mansion was almost imperceptible, exactly as Charles had requested. Meanwhile, Lucy remained immersed in her silence. She went to school, came back, did her homework, but with no life in her eyes. Like a little mechanical doll, performing programmed movements. The teacher's reports were always the same. Lucy doesn't interact. Lucy doesn't participate. Lucy seems absent. Charles tried everything. Gifts, outings, stories. Nothing worked. The chasm between them only widened. That night, he had worked late in his office. Important documents, deadlines to meet, meetings to prepare for. Work had always been his refuge when reality became too heavy to bear. It was past midnight when he finally shut down the computer and headed upstairs. The house was silent, wrapped in the shadows drawn by the night. Only the dim light from the hallway lamps guided his way. As he passed Lucy's room, he noticed a sliver of light under the door. Strange, she should have been asleep for hours. He knocked softly. "Lucy, still awake, honey?" There was no answer. Charles opened the door slowly. Lucy was sitting on the bed, hugging the old teddy bear she'd had since she was a baby. She didn't seem surprised to see him. It was as if she had been waiting. "Can't sleep?" Charles asked, entering the room. Lucy shook her head no. "Nightmares again." "They're not nightmares," she answered, her voice small. "They're memories." Charles sat on the edge of the bed, maintaining a distance he didn't know how to cross. "What memories?" "Of Clara." "Of the day they took her," Charles sighed. "They always came back to this, and Lucy, we've already talked about this. I know what I saw, Daddy." There was something different in Lucy's tone, a certainty, a firmness that made her seem older than her 6 years. Her eyes, so much like Elizabeth's, met Charles's without hesitation. "Uncle Brandon came here on the day of the theft. You weren't here. I saw him go up to your room and leave quickly." Charles felt a chill in his stomach. It was the first time Lucy had said it so clearly, so directly. No crying, no shouting, just the facts, presented with the brutal simplicity only children can manage. "How do you know it was that day?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "Because that was when Clara and I were making bracelets. Remember, you came home with Uncle Brandon and everyone started looking for the necklace." Charles remembered Lucy and Clara in the girls' room, colored threads scattered on the carpet. How had he not made the connection before? "Are you sure you saw Uncle Brandon go up to my room?" Lucy nodded vigorously. "I'd gone to get more thread from the hall closet. I saw him looking around like someone doing something wrong. Then he went up the stairs really fast." "And did you tell anyone this?" "I tried to tell you many times." Lucy's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Say but you never listen." The words hit Charles like a physical blow. It was true. Lucy had tried to speak on the day of Clara's arrest. She had tried in the following days, and he had always cut her off, always interrupted, always dismissed her. "I'm listening now," he said softly. "What else did you see?" He wasn't upstairs for long. Then he came running down. He was running his hand through his hair, like this. Lucy mimicked the nervous gesture Charles knew so well, a tic Brandon had had since childhood. "When you came home with him later, he pretended he had just arrived too." Charles felt something break inside him, a certainty, a conviction that until that moment had resisted all doubts. Lucy's voice, ignored for so long, finally echoed with clarity in his mind. Brandon, his own brother. "Why would Uncle Brandon do that?" he asked, more to himself than to Lucy. "I don't know," she answered with the brutal honesty of children. "Grown-ups do bad things sometimes." Charles swallowed hard. "Lucy, why didn't you tell me this before?" "So..." Clearly. The girl hugged her bear tighter. "I did. Many times. You didn't want to listen." Another undeniable truth. How many times had Lucy tried to say exactly what she was saying now? How many times had he silenced her, convinced that he knew more, understood more, saw more? "I'm listening now," Charles repeated, moving closer to his daughter. "And I believe you." Lucy looked at him with surprise, as if those words were an unexpected gift. "Really? Really? And I'm going to fix my mistake." For the first time in weeks, Charles saw a flicker of life in his daughter's eyes, a small flame of hope. "Are you going to bring Clara back?" I'll do whatever it takes to find the truth. And if the truth is that Clara is innocent, yes, I'll bring her back. Lucy held out her pinky finger. Promise? Charles hooked his finger with hers, sealing the pact as they did when she was smaller. I promise. When Lucy finally fell asleep, Charles remained by her bed, watching her peaceful face. The first real crack in his conviction had formed, and now it was expanding rapidly, threatening to bring down the entire edifice of certainties he had built. Brandon, his own brother, the person who had always been by his side, who had supported him when Elizabeth died, who never questioned his version of the events of the theft, but also the person who stood to gain the most from Clara's misfortune, the person who had insisted on her guilt from the very first moment. Charles left Lucy's room with heavy steps. The night was late, but sleep was far away. There was a call to make. The morning after his conversation with Lucy, Charles cancelled all his meetings. For the first time in years, the company would have to wait. There was something more urgent to do, a truth to uncover, a possible injustice to correct. Sitting in his study, Charles stared at the computer screen. The cursor blinked in the search bar, like a silent accusation. It was as simple as it was humiliating. He had never looked up Clara. He had never been interested in knowing who the woman who had spent 2 years caring for his house, his daughter, really was. The woman he had accused of theft without hesitation, Clara Wright, 30 years old. That was all he knew. He typed her name and waited. The results weren't numerous. Clara had no social media presence, except for a basic Facebook profile, long inactive. He found a graduation photo from 5 years ago. Clara receiving a diploma, smiling shyly. A graduate with honors in education from the state university. Charles felt the first blow of reality. Clara wasn't just a cleaner, she was a qualified teacher. Why was she working as a domestic helper? The answer came a few clicks later. The recession had closed several schools in the region. Thousands of newly graduated teachers, with no experience, were left without opportunities. A local newspaper article mentioned Clara as a volunteer in an adult literacy program. Another showed her at a charity event for underprivileged children. An educated woman, dedicated to her community, who had to take a job as a cleaner to survive. Did I condemn an innocent woman just because she was young and defenseless? Charles muttered to himself, his throat suddenly dry. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Rawlins. Mr. Ellsworth, we need to talk. In person. I found something. Half an hour later, Charles parked in front of a small cafe downtown. Rawlins was already there, a worn leather briefcase on the table. Thanks for coming so quickly, the detective said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. Charles sat down, tense. What did you find? Rawlins opened the briefcase and slid a photograph across the table. It was a pawn ticket. The necklace turned up. Or rather, I found it. In a pawn shop on the other side of town. Discreet establishment. Select clientele. Not the kind of place a cleaner with no criminal record would know how to find. Charles picked up the receipt, feeling his heart race. How did you know where to look? I didn't. I visited 23 pawn shops in the last 10 days. Rawlins gave a half smile. It's what we do when we don't have supercomputers and facial recognition software. And how much did they pay for it? 20,000, a fraction of its real value. Who sold it? Rawlins slid over another sheet of paper, a copy of a fake ID with a poor quality photo. A man named James Peterson, obviously a fake ID. But what was interesting was the clerk's description. Charles held his breath. And what did he look like? Tall, elegant, well-dressed, spoke like someone educated, probably from a wealthy family. But he was nervous, very nervous, hands shaking, constantly looking over his shoulder. Charles closed his eyes. Brandon, it had to be. The clerk said one more thing, Rawlins continued. The man had a tic. He kept running his hand through his hair, like this. He demonstrated the gesture. It was like a punch to the gut, the same gesture Lucy had described the night before. Brandon's nervous tic since childhood. I want that necklace back, Charles said, his voice firm. Already taken care of. I explained the situation, showed them the necklace's documentation. They agreed to return it upon reimbursement of the $20,000. And the police? Rawlins hesitated. I haven't involved them yet. I thought you might want to check a few things first. Charles understood the implication. Rawlins was giving him a chance to confront Brandon before making it official, a professional courtesy, or perhaps just human empathy. Thank you, he said simply. After leaving the cafe, Charles didn't go home. Instead, he drove to the building where Brandon worked, an investment firm in the financial district. He had no plan, just a visceral need to confront his brother, to look him in the eye and ask why, but Brandon wasn't there. His secretary, an efficient woman with heavy-rimmed glasses, informed him that he had taken a few days off. Personal matters, she explained by sights, without going into detail. Charles thanked her and left, more puzzled than before. Brandon never took days off. He was as much of a workaholic as he was. He decided to stop by his brother's apartment, a luxurious flat on the east side of the city. The doorman, who had known Charles for years, informed him that Brandon wasn't in. He left yesterday with 2 suitcases, said he'd be away for a while. The sense of alarm grew. Was Brandon running away? Back in the car, Charles called Rawlins. My brother's gone, took days off, left with suitcases. This isn't normal. How much does he owe? Rawlins asked directly. What do you mean? Men like your brother don't steal family heirlooms for fun, Mr. Ellsworth. They do it when they're desperate. So how much does he owe? And to whom? Charles didn't know how to answer. Brandon's financial life had always been a mystery. He earned well, lived well, but always seemed to need more. Occasional small loans, investments he asked Charles to partner in, deals that never fully materialized. I don't know, he admitted. But I'm going to find out. Over the next few hours, Charles delved into his brother's financial life with a determination that surprised himself. He called mutual friends, business partners, even the accountant at the firm that managed Brandon's personal finances. What he discovered left him cold. Brandon owed money to loan sharks. A lot. Sports betting, high-stakes poker games, risky investments that went wrong. A spiral of debt that had been growing for at least 2 years. He's in over his head, Mr. Ellsworth, the accountant confided, after much insistence on the confidentiality of the conversation. I tried to warn him, tried to get him to seek help. But your brother. He always believes the next big deal will solve everything. The image of Brandon that Charles had always cultivated, the responsible, competent, balanced brother, crumbled with each new revelation. When he returned home, it was already evening. Lucy was asleep, a small relief. Charles wouldn't know what to say to her now, with his mind in turmoil. He sat in the dark study, only the desk lamp illuminating the papers he had gathered during the day. Bank statements, credit reports, loan records, all telling the same story of growing financial desperation. The phone rang once more. It was Rawlins. I spoke to more people at the pawn shop. The man who sold the necklace said he needed the money to pay an urgent debt. Mentioned something about them not waiting any longer. He was terrified. Charles closed his eyes. Brandon being threatened by loan sharks, desperate enough to steal Elizabeth's necklace, the most valuable and personal piece of jewelry Charles owned. And what about Clara? He asked, his voice choked. I investigated everything. Bank accounts, work history, background checks, nothing. Absolutely nothing to suggest any suspicious activity. She is exactly what she appears to be, a hard-working, honest woman who had the bad luck to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The words fell on Charles like stones. Clara was innocent, always had been, and he had sent her to jail without hesitation. So what do I do now? He asked, more to himself than to Rawlins. The decision is yours, Mr. Ellsworth. I can take the evidence to the police immediately. Your maid would be free in a matter of days. Your brother, on the other hand? Charles understood the implication. Brandon would face serious charges, theft, fraud, identity theft, years in prison. I need to think, he said finally. After hanging up, Charles remained motionless in the darkness of the study. The hours passed as his mind replayed every moment since the necklace disappeared, every decision, every mistake. The image of Clara being taken away by the police while Lucy screamed. The easy, almost automatic conviction that the cleaner was guilty. The way he had ignored his daughter's protests, the inconsistencies in the story, the signs that something was wrong. Did I condemn an innocent woman just because she was young and defenseless? The question he had asked himself earlier now had a painfully clear answer. Yes, and why? Because it was convenient. Because a guilty cleaner made more sense in his organized world than a desperate, lying brother. Because Clara didn't matter, not really. She was just the maid, a faceless figure, without a story, without humanity. Charles stood up and walked to the window. The night was clear, starry. Somewhere in the city, Clara was in a cell, paying for a crime she hadn't committed. Alone, confused, betrayed. For the first time, Charles truly saw her, not as a maid, a function, a social role, but as a person, a 30-year-old woman, intelligent, educated, kind to his daughter, a woman who comforted Lucy during her nightmares, who taught her to make bracelets, who brought light into a house that had grown dark after Elizabeth's death. A woman whose life he had destroyed with a single accusation. The decision formed in his mind with crystalline clarity. He picked up the phone and dialed Rawlins' number. "Take everything to the police first thing in the morning," he said without preamble. "I want Clara free as soon as possible." "And your brother?" Charles closed his eyes. Brandon was family. His only brother, a childhood accomplice and a confidant, support in difficult times. But also the man who had stolen Elizabeth's necklace, who had let an innocent person be arrested, who had lied shamelessly while someone else suffered the consequences of his actions. "Do what's necessary," he finally replied. "The truth needs to come out." Completely. As he hung up, Charles felt an immense weight leave his shoulders, replaced by another, different one, the weight of responsibility. He would have to fix what he had broken. He would have to face Clara, ask for forgiveness, try to compensate her somehow, though he knew nothing could erase the days she had spent unjustly in prison. And he would have to explain everything to Lucy, how the father she trusted had failed so completely, ignoring her voice, devaluing her testimony. The doubt that had started as a small crack had now grown, tearing down walls, exposing truths that could no longer be denied. And in the midst of the ruins, Charles finally saw clearly, not just what happened to the necklace, but something much deeper about himself, about his prejudices, about the man he had become. The question was no longer, did I condemn an innocent woman? But how can I become the kind of man who would never make such a mistake again? Before going to the police, there was a stop Charles needed to make. An unavoidable conversation, no matter how painful it would be. The day broke overcast, with a fine drizzle that blurred the city's outlines. Charles drove in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel with unnecessary force. The evidence Rawlins had gathered was on the passenger seat, inside a brown leather briefcase, irrefutable proof of Brandon's guilt. But he didn't need proof. He needed to hear the confession from his own brother's lips. Contrary to what the doorman had said the day before, Brandon hadn't traveled. Charles had discovered this after a call to their mother, who casually mentioned that her youngest son had visited her that afternoon. He seemed nervous, she had commented. Said he was thinking of taking a long vacation. Running away, Brandon was planning his escape. The building where his brother lived was an elegant edifice on the east side of the city, with a facade of glass and marble. The kind of place that required a generous salary or mounting debt to maintain. Charles parked and went straight up, without announcing himself. He knew Brandon's routine. At this time of the morning, he would be getting ready to leave, having his coffee while checking emails on his tablet. He stopped in front of the door and took a deep breath before ringing the bell. Once, twice, 3 times. Silence. He was about to give up when he heard movement on the other side. The door opened just enough to reveal Brandon's face, bloodshot eyes, unshaven, disheveled hair. "Charles?" He seemed genuinely surprised. "What are you doing here so early?" "We need to talk." Brandon hesitated, glancing over his shoulder into the apartment, as if checking if it was presentable, or if there was something to hide. Now's not a good time. I'm in a hurry. Charles placed his hand on the door, preventing it from being closed. It won't take long. Something in his tone of voice, an unusual firmness, a cold determination, made Brandon back away and open the door completely. The apartment was a mess. Clothes scattered, half-open suitcases, papers stacked chaotically on the table. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with a faint odor of alcohol. "Going on a trip?" Charles asked, though the answer was obvious. "A retreat. I need to clear my head." Brandon tried to smile, but the result was just a nervous grimace. "Want some coffee? I just made it." "No, thank you. I don't plan on staying long." Brandon ran a hand through his hair, that familiar tick, now laden with a whole new meaning. He walked to the open-plan kitchen and poured himself a cup of coffee, more to have something to do with his hands than out of need. "So what do we need to talk about?" Charles decided to get straight to the point. He placed the briefcase on the coffee table and opened it, revealing the photos, receipts, and documents. "You were there, on the day of the theft." Brandon froze, the cup halfway to his lips, his eyes fixed on the scattered papers, then on Charles's face. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Please, Brandon." "It's over. The necklace was found at the pawn shop. With your description, your fake ID." All the color drained from Brandon's face. He placed the cup on the counter carefully, as if fearing that any sudden movement might break not just the porcelain, but the entire facade he had built. "You don't understand," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "Then explain it to me." Brandon walked to the window, his back to Charles. The rain had picked up, beating against the glass in an irregular rhythm. "I never meant to hurt anyone, but you did. Clara has been in jail for weeks, accused of a crime you committed." Brandon turned around, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I didn't plan it. It wasn't premeditated. I just needed money, urgently." "Why?" "I was in over my head. Gambling. Betting. I was going to be threatened." His voice failed. "They gave me a deadline, said it would be the last time they asked nicely." Charles felt a mix of anger and pity. Brandon had always been the weaker brother, more susceptible to pressure, more willing to take shortcuts. "So you decided to steal Elizabeth's necklace?" Brandon looked down. "I knew you kept it in the drawer. I knew how much it was worth. I thought it would take you a while to notice, that I could somehow return it later. But I did notice. Yes, the same day." Brandon gave a bitter laugh. "And then you called the police, and that girl was there." "Clara, Clara." Brandon repeated the name as if trying it out for the first time. "So she was perfect. The cleaner who cleaned your room, who had access, who no one would question." Charles felt the anger rise, hot and suffocating. "You saw an innocent woman being accused and said nothing." "What could I say? Sorry, it was me. I'd be arrested. And now Clara is in jail in your place." Brandon ran his hands over his face, rubbing his eyes hard. I know it's terrible, but you don't understand what it's like to be desperate, Charles. You never have." "Didn't you think?" Charles took a step forward, his voice rising. "You let a 30-year-old girl get arrested, innocent." "I'm sorry." The words came out weak, pathetic in their inadequacy. "You're sorry?" Charles shook his head, incredulous. "I'm sorry doesn't fix anything, Brandon. It doesn't erase what you did. It doesn't give Clara back weeks of her life. What do you want me to do?" The tone was almost pleading. "I want you to own up, to go to the police and confess, to clear her name." Brandon looked down, his eyes fixed on the floor. His silence was answer enough. "You're not going to do it, are you?" Charles stated, the disappointment evident in his voice. "I can't go to jail, Charles. I wouldn't survive in there." "And Clara, does she deserve to be there?" Brandon didn't answer. There was no possible answer that wouldn't condemn him further. Charles gathered the documents and put them back in the briefcase. His decision was already made. "I'm going to the police today, with or without you." "Charles, please." Brandon took a step toward him, his eyes pleading. "We're brothers, family. Family doesn't do what you did." Charles walked to the door, stopping with his hand on the knob. You have until noon. If you don't turn yourself in voluntarily, I'm taking everything to the police. Brandon looked like a drowning man, desperately searching for something to hold on to. You'd really ruin my life over a maid. The question hung in the air, laden with all the assumptions, prejudices, and privileges that Charles himself had shared until recently. No, Brandon. You ruined your own life, and you almost destroyed an innocent person's in the process. Charles left, closing the door firmly behind him. In the silent corridor of the luxurious building, he felt a suffocating mix of shame and outrage. Shame for sharing the blood of someone capable of such cowardice. Outrage for having been so blind, so willing to believe the worst about Clara and the best about Brandon. As he drove back home, the rain fell harder, as if the sky itself shared his indignation. A question echoed in his mind, unanswered. How do you fix something so completely broken? Charles drove back home through the now heavy rain. The windshield wipers slid back and forth in a steady rhythm, like a metronome marking the minutes of his silent journey. With every passing block, he felt the weight of the conversation with Brandon, the weight of his own failures, the weight of the injustice he had allowed to happen. Sometimes the truth doesn't set you free. Sometimes it just transfers the burden from one shoulder to another. When he parked in the mansion's driveway, he noticed something was different. The light in Lucy's room was on, even though it was only 7:30 in the morning. She usually didn't wake up until 8, when Mrs. Winters would come to call her for breakfast. Charles entered the house quietly, leaving his wet coat on the rack in the hall. He went up the stairs, feeling each step like a small mountain to be climbed. How would he explain everything to Lucy? How would he say that she had been right all along? That the father she was supposed to trust had failed to listen to her? The door to Lucy's room was ajar. Charles knocked softly before pushing it open. Lucy was sitting on the edge of her bed, still in her pajamas, her messy blonde hair framing her small face. She was hugging the old teddy bear against her chest, as she always did when she was anxious. Her blue eyes met Charles's immediately, bright and alert. "You went to see Uncle Brandon," she said. It wasn't a question. Charles felt a shiver run down his spine. How did she know? "Yes," he answered simply, entering the room. "How did you know?" "I heard you talking to the man in the hat yesterday, saying you were going to confront Uncle Brandon." The man in the hat, Rawlins, and his old brown fedora, a relic from his time as a police officer. Charles hadn't realized Lucy had overheard them. "Were you eavesdropping?" he asked, unable to hide a slight tone of surprise. Lucy shrugged, a gesture so adult it seemed out of place on her small frame. "You were talking about Clara." "I wanted to know." Charles nodded, understanding. Of course, she wanted to know. While the adults schemed and made decisions, Lucy waited, worried about the one person who had truly listened to her, who had been there when she needed it most. "Can I sit?" Charles asked, gesturing to the edge of the bed. Lucy shifted slightly to the side, making room. Charles sat down, keeping a small distance. He didn't know where to begin. How could he summarize everything he had discovered, everything he had felt, in words a 6-year-old could understand? "Uncle Brandon took Mommy's necklace," he said finally, opting for the direct truth. "You were right all along." Lucy showed no surprise. She just nodded slightly, as if confirming something she already knew with absolute certainty. "How did he confess?" "Yes." Charles hesitated. "He was in trouble. He owed money to dangerous people. He was desperate." Lucy frowned, processing the information. "But why did he let Clara get arrested? She didn't do anything." The question, so simple, so direct, hit Charles with full force. It was the very heart of the matter, the one that revealed Brandon's true moral weakness, and by extension his own. "Because he was a coward," Charles answered, his voice harder than he intended. "Because it was easier to let someone else take the blame. And you believed him, not me." Again, it wasn't a question, just a statement of fact. Charles felt his heart clench. "Yes, Lucy, I made a terrible mistake." A heavy silence fell between them. Outside, the rain continued, tapping against the window in a steady rhythm, as if applauding the painful honesty that was finally emerging. "Are you going to bring Clara back?" Lucy asked finally, her small voice filled with hope. "I'm going to do everything I can. I'm going to the police today with all the evidence. I'll hire the best lawyers. I'll do whatever it takes to get her released." Lucy studied her father's face for a long moment, as if assessing the sincerity of his words. Then, with devastating simplicity, she asked, "Are you listening to me now?" The question was so innocent and yet so profound that Charles felt his eyes sting with unshed tears. In those 5 simple words lay the entire core of the problem. Not just the theft, the wrongful imprisonment, the brother's betrayal, but something much more fundamental: the failure to listen to a child who was only telling the truth. Charles slid off the bed and knelt before his daughter, bringing himself to her eye level. He wanted her to see his sincerity, to feel how true his words were. "Yes, and I'm sorry I didn't listen to you before, sweetheart. You knew all along." Lucy's eyes glistened with unshed tears. For a moment, Charles feared she would reject him, that the broken trust was irreparable. But then, with the capacity for forgiveness that only children possess in its purest form, Lucy let go of the teddy bear and opened her arms. Charles hugged her, feeling her small, fragile body against his. A sob escaped, then another. He couldn't tell if they were his or Lucy's. Maybe they belonged to both of them. Tears of relief, of remorse, of hope. It was more than a hug. It was an apology. It was a promise to do better. It was an acknowledgement that sometimes those we consider too small to understand are the ones who see most clearly. They stayed like that for a long time, while the rain outside gradually subsided, as if the sky itself recognized that the tears had already done their cleansing work. When they finally separated, Charles saw something in Lucy's face he hadn't seen in weeks, a small smile, shy but real. "We're going to bring Clara home," he said, not as a question, but as a solemn promise. Lucy nodded seriously. "Will she forgive us?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Us. Not just Charles, but Lucy too. As if she shared the blame, as if she felt she had also failed on some level. "I'm sure she will," Charles replied, though he had no such certainty. "And if she doesn't, we'll give her all the time she needs." Lucy seemed satisfied with the answer. She got off the bed and held out her hand to her father, a gesture so small and so significant. "Breakfast?" she asked, with a normality that felt like a precious gift after weeks of silence and pain. Charles took her small hand in his. "Breakfast," he agreed. Together, they left the room and went down the stairs, father and daughter, united not just by blood, but now by something deeper, a shared truth, an acknowledgement of mistakes, a promise of reparation, a reunion that was also a redemption, a beginning, not an end. Charles had never been inside a prison before. The grey, imposing building, with its high walls and narrow windows, seemed out of place in the urban landscape, a constant reminder that not everyone shared the same freedom. After passing through metal detectors, searches and security procedures, Charles was led to a visiting room. It wasn't like in the movies. No glass partitions, no phones for communication, just a simple room with plastic tables and chairs bolted to the floor. A guard stood discreetly in the corner, watching without interfering. Charles sat down, his hands sweating slightly. What would he say to Clara? How could he ask for forgiveness for something so serious? The door on the other side of the room opened, and Clara entered, accompanied by another guard. Charles almost didn't recognize her, not because of the orange prison uniform, nor her blonde hair lacking its usual shine. It was her expression, a mixture of caution and resignation he had never seen on her face before. Clara stopped for a moment upon seeing him, clearly surprised. She was probably expecting her lawyer, not the man who had sent her to this place. "Mr. Ellsworth," she said formally, approaching the table. "Clara," Charles replied, his voice softer than he intended. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." She sat down across from him, maintaining an erect, dignified posture. Her hands, which Charles remembered always being in motion, cleaning, organizing, weaving bracelets with Lucy, now rested quietly on the table. "I didn't think I had a choice," she answered honestly. Charles felt the blow. Of course, she thought that. In the hierarchy he himself had established, what was a request from the boss but a disguised order? You always have a choice, Clara, always. An uncomfortable silence settled between them. Outside, life went on. Inside, time seemed suspended, as if waiting for truths to be spoken before it could flow again. Lucy asks about you every day, Charles finally said. Something changed in Clara's face, a softening, a light in her eyes that had been dull until then. How is she? Sad, angry, wiser than any 6-year-old should be. Charles hesitated. She knew all along. She tried to tell me. I didn't listen. Clara nodded slightly, unsurprised. Lucy was always observant. She sees things most people ignore. She saw Brandon enter my room that day. She tried to tell everyone. No one believed her. Clara looked up, meeting Charles's eyes for the first time. Brandon, your brother? Charles felt the weight of shame increase. She didn't even know who had truly wronged her. Yes, he was the one who stole the necklace. He confessed. Clara absorbed the information in silence. Her face showed no anger, no triumph, just a weary acceptance. Why? Debts, gambling. He was being threatened. Charles made a vague gesture with his hand. None of that matters, really. Nothing justifies what he did, what we did. Clara looked away, her gaze fixed on a distant point on the opposite wall. 3 weeks, she said softly. 3 weeks in here, wondering what I could have done wrong, trying to understand why everyone so easily believed I was capable of stealing. The answer hung in the air, unsaid but perfectly clear. Because she was the maid, the disposable person, the one who didn't truly belong in that world. I came to ask for your forgiveness, Clara. Charles leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the young woman's face. I know I don't deserve it. I know words can't erase what you've been through, but I need you to know how sorry I am, how ashamed I am of what I did. Clara looked back at him. There was a maturity in her gaze that went beyond her 30 years, the forced maturity of someone who had learned, in the worst possible way, how the world really works. You took care of my daughter like no one else, and I treated you like you were nothing. The words came out with more emotion than Charles intended, laden with a truth he could only now see in its full extent. Clara had been more than a cleaner. She had been an angel for Lucy when he was too busy with his own problems to notice the void in his daughter's life. I was just doing my job, Clara replied, but there was a softness in her voice that wasn't there before. No, you did much more. Lucy told me about the nightmares after her mother's death. How you would wake up in the middle of the night to comfort her. How you read stories, taught her things, played with her. That wasn't in your contract, Clara. That was kindness, pure and simple. Clara looked down, and Charles realized she was fighting back tears. 3 weeks in prison hadn't broken her dignity, but a kind word, a sincere acknowledgement, cut deeper. I went to the police this morning, Charles continued. I brought all the evidence, the recovered necklace, Brandon's confession, Lucy's testimony. They are processing your release as we speak. Clara looked up, her eyes wide with surprise. I'm getting out. Today, if everything goes as planned. Charles paused. I've hired the best lawyers. They are preparing a lawsuit for emotional distress. You will receive significant financial compensation. I don't want your money, Clara replied immediately, a flash of pride in her eyes. I know, but it's the least I can do. Use it to start your life over, to study, travel, do whatever you've always dreamed of. Clara didn't answer. She seemed to be absorbing the reality that the nightmare was ending, that the prison doors would open, and she would return to the outside world. And Lucy, she asked finally, can I see her? Charles felt a tightness in his chest. Even after everything, Clara's first concern was for his daughter. She's waiting for you. In fact, he hesitated, unsure if he should continue. I'd like to offer you your job back, not as a cleaner, as Lucy's official tutor, with a salary commensurate with your degree in education. Clara stared at him, surprise evident on her face. How do you know about my degree? I looked you up too late, I know. But I did. A thoughtful silence settled between them. Clara seemed to be weighing the offer, considering the pros and cons of returning to a place that had been the scene of so much injustice. "I'll understand if you don't want to," Charles added quickly. "In fact, it would be perfectly understandable if you never wanted to see me again. But Lucy, she misses you terribly." "I need to think," Clara answered finally, "about everything, about what I want to do now." "Of course, all the time you need." The guard approached, indicating that visiting time was almost over. Charles stood up, feeling there was more, much more to be said, but knowing that some things needed time. "Thank you for seeing me, Clara. And once again, from the bottom of my heart, I am sorry." Clara nodded, promising nothing, but not explicitly rejecting his apology. It was more than Charles deserved, and he knew it. 5 hours later, Charles waited in the prison parking lot, leaning against his car. The lawyer had called, the release was processed, the documents signed. Clara would be out any moment. The afternoon sun bathed the grey courtyard in a golden light that seemed almost ironic, as if nature were trying to compensate with beauty for what men had built with coldness. Finally, the doors opened. Clara walked out, carrying a small bag with her belongings. She had changed out of the prison uniform and into her own clothes, simple jeans and a light blue blouse. She stopped for a moment, breathing in the fresh air deeply, as if trying to wash the weeks of confinement from her lungs. Charles approached hesitantly, unsure if his presence would be welcome. "Can I give you a ride home?" Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you, but I'll call a cab. I need some time alone." Charles nodded, respecting her decision. "I understand, but if you change your mind about the job offer, or if you just want to see Lucy—" "Tomorrow," Clara said, surprising him. "I'll come by tomorrow to see Lucy. Just her, for now." A small sense of relief washed over Charles. It was a start. A small step in the right direction. She'll be thrilled. The next day, promptly at 2 in the afternoon, the doorbell of the Ellsworth mansion rang. Lucy, who had spent the entire morning alternating between frantically tidying her room and anxiously watching from the window, ran to the door before any adult could reach it. "Wait, Lucy," Charles called, coming down the stairs quickly. "Let me check first." But it was too late. Lucy had already opened the door, and there stood Clara, wearing a simple dress and carrying a small gift bag. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if time had frozen, as if the entire universe was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. Then Lucy let out a cry of pure crystalline joy and ran to Clara, hugging her with all the strength her small arms could muster. "You're back! You're back!" she repeated like a mantra, as tears of happiness streamed down her face. Clara knelt, hugging Lucy back with equal intensity. Her eyes were also moist, but there was a smile on her face, a true smile, that reached her eyes in a way Charles hadn't seen since before the incident. "I told you you'd be back," Lucy declared, pulling away just enough to look at Clara's face. "I knew it." Clara ran a hand through Lucy's hair, a gesture so familiar and yet so new, now charged with a deeper meaning. "Thank you for helping me," she said softly. "You are a very special little girl." Lucy smiled, her face lit with a joy that had been absent for weeks. "Are you staying?" Clara hesitated, glancing briefly at Charles, who remained at a respectful distance, watching the reunion. "I just came to visit today," she answered gently. "I brought something for you." She handed the bag to Lucy, who opened it eagerly. Inside was a small bracelet-making kit, colored threads, beads, clasps. "So we can pick up where we left off," Clara explained. Lucy hugged the gift to her chest as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. And in a way it was, a symbol of continuity, of return, of healing. "Come on," Lucy said, taking Clara's hand. "Let's go to my room. I have so much to tell you." Before following Lucy up the stairs, Clara looked at Charles one more time. There wasn't complete forgiveness in her gaze. That would come with time, if it came at all. But there was something equally valuable, a beginning. A willingness to build something new from the ruins of what had been destroyed. Charles nodded slightly, a silent thank you for this second chance he knew he didn't deserve. As he watched Lucy lead Clara upstairs, their voices blending in an excited conversation that echoed through the previously silent house, Charles understood a fundamental truth. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It doesn't undo mistakes. It doesn't eliminate scars, but it heals, slowly, imperfectly, but it heals. And sometimes, that's all you can hope for. And all that really matters. 2 weeks after Clara's release, Charles gathered all the mansion's employees in the grand hall. Mrs. Winters, Jenkins, Mrs. Palmer, the gardener, the maids, everyone was present, curious about the reason for the unexpected summons. Clara was also there, at Charles's invitation. She stood near the door, as if not yet feeling completely at ease in the space that had once been her workplace. In recent weeks, she had visited Lucy regularly, but had always maintained a polite distance from the other staff, especially those who had remained silent during her accusation. Charles cleared his throat, getting everyone's attention. He seemed nervous, a rare sight for a man usually so self-assured. "Thank you for being here," he began. "I know you have your duties, so I'll be brief. I've gathered you to do something I should have done a long time ago. Admit my mistake and apologize." A murmur went through the room. Some glanced at Clara, others looked down, uncomfortable. As you all know, Clara was unjustly accused of a crime she did not commit. A crime for which my own brother is now answering to the law. Brandon had turned himself into the police the day after his confrontation with Charles, not out of nobility, but because he realized he had no choice. The evidence was overwhelming. He was now out on bail, awaiting trial. I failed not only Clara, but all of you. I fostered an environment where the truth was stifled by fear and prejudice, where an accusation could destroy someone's reputation without question. That ends today. Charles looked directly at Clara, who watched him with a neutral, hard-to-read expression. "Clara, in front of everyone who witnessed your unjust humiliation, I ask for your forgiveness. I know words are not enough, which is why I've taken concrete steps." He made a gesture, and Jenkins approached with an envelope, which he handed to Clara. "This is a check as financial compensation for the damages caused. It doesn't represent what you deserve. No amount of money could, but I hope it helps you rebuild your life in any way you choose." Clara opened the envelope, and her eyes widened slightly at the amount. It was more money than she had ever imagined possessing. "Furthermore," Charles continued, "I would like to formally offer you the position of educational tutor for Lucy, with a salary commensurate with your degree in education and full freedom to implement the educational program you see fit." A complete silence filled the room. Mrs. Winters looked particularly shocked. The cleaner, now an educational tutor, with authority over the Ellsworth heiress's education. "I know we've discussed this privately," Charles added, "but I wanted to make the invitation official in front of everyone, so there is no doubt about your position in this house from now on." Clara took a step forward, the envelope still in her hands. All eyes turned to her. "Mr. Ellsworth, I accept your offer and your apology." Her voice was calm but firm. "Not for you, but for Lucy. She deserves stability and consistent educational support." A collective sigh of relief went through the room. The tension that had hung in the air began to dissipate. "As for the rest of you," Charles looked at the staff, "I expect you to treat Clara with the respect she deserves. Any sign of disrespect or prejudice will result in immediate dismissal. Is that clear?" Everyone nodded, some more enthusiastically than others. Mrs. Palmer, the cook, was the only one to smile openly. She had always believed in Clara's innocence. "Excellent. Now I'm sure you all have work to do. Clara, if you could stay for a moment." As the staff dispersed, Charles approached Clara. "Thank you for accepting. Lucy will be overjoyed. As I said, I'm doing it for her." Clara put the envelope in her purse, "But I appreciate the public gesture. It was important. You can start whenever you'd like. Your old room has been prepared, in case you prefer to live here. Or we can arrange for daily transport if you'd rather maintain your independence." Clara considered for a moment. "I think I'll stay here during the week. It will be easier to develop a consistent program with Lucy." Charles nodded, pleased. "The room is yours then. And Clara, thank you for giving this house and Lucy a second chance. Sometimes, Clara replied with a small smile, second chances are what save us, all of us. 2 months later, on a sunny spring afternoon, the garden of the Ellsworth mansion had been transformed. What was once a formal and impersonal space was now alive with small, colorful flower beds, each reflecting the personality of its little gardener. Lucy, kneeling on the dark earth, was carefully digging a hole for another violet seedling. Beside her, Clara offered gentle guidance. "Not too deep," she said. "The roots need room to breathe." Lucy nodded, focused on her task. Her small hands, once immaculate as befitting an Ellsworth heiress, were now dirty with soil, and she couldn't have been happier. From his office window, Charles watched the scene. The transformation was evident not just in the garden, but in Lucy. The silent, sad little girl had given way again to the vibrant child she had always been. She laughed, sang, asked endless questions, eager to learn everything Clara could teach. And Clara, she had changed too. The initial caution, the understandable reserve, gradually gave way to a renewed confidence. It wasn't the same as before, it couldn't be, after what she had been through. But she had a new serenity, a strength that came from having faced injustice and survived. Charles stepped away from the window, leaving them alone in their special moment. He had learned, painfully, that some relationships needed space to flourish without interference. In the garden, Lucy and Clara continued their work in a comfortable silence. They didn't need words, the care was present in every gesture, every look, every shared smile. When the last violet was planted, Lucy sat back on her heels, admiring her work. "Do you think they'll grow up to be pretty?" she asked, looking at Clara. "Definitely. You planted them with care, gave them enough water, chose a spot with good light, everything they need to blossom." Lucy smiled, satisfied. Then, impulsively, she hugged Clara, smudging the tutor's simple dress with dirt. Clara returned the hug without hesitation, not caring about the dirt. Some things were infinitely more valuable than clean clothes. Around them, the garden seemed to vibrate with life and possibility. The newly planted violets, the already blooming daisies, the rosebuds promising future beauty. A small universe in constant renewal, just like the trust that was finally beginning to blossom between them again. Not exactly as before, deeper perhaps, more tested, more resilient. Like plants that survive the winter and return in the spring, different but vigorous, a fair ending after all, and, more importantly, a new beginning. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next ones. Leave a like because it helps this story get recommended to more people. See you in the next story.